eNCA's Annika Larsen joins us from Parliament. Annika, good morning. Of course, this conversation is really where the issue of land will be centered, at least from a constitutional perspective, about how to move forward.
That's right, Kathy. Parliament is officially in recess, but 24 MPs from the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces have been delegated to crisscross across the country to coastal and inland regions as from next week to hold meaningful public hearings on whether there should be amendments to Section 25 of the Constitution for the state to appropriate land in the public interest, and that's really the key word. I think that's part of this legislation, without compensation. This is just because the ownership of state land to black South Africans has been so slow in coming and goes back to what Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, called the original sin, the Land Act of 1913, which only allowed 13% of the land to be owned by black South Africans.
Annika, very interesting choice of words there, meaningful hearings. That means that there's a certain framework within Parliament with which Parliament is expecting these public hearings to be held. Does that also then have anything to do with who they will be taking submissions from?
That's actually a really good point you raise. I tell you why. Because in many cases where there has been public hearings that need to be held, if you even look back at some of the nuclear energy public hearings that didn't quite get underway, but there were these quasi sort of public hearings, also with the Khoisan Traditional Leaders Bill, there hasn't been adequate public participation, and it's been a big criticism of the state and of Parliament and of government. And in this case, they really need to try and get to rural areas, especially, for instance, speaking to women, not just, traditional leaders who are generally men, and ask them for their opinion, and church leaders who are generally tend to be male, and heading up sort of patriarchal ownership of land. They need to speak to women about what they think about land ownership, and then they need to come to urban areas too and talk to them about which people need affordable housing closer to their places of work. So it's not just farmland that we're talking about, it's urban and coastal, inland, it's across the country. And it really can't be an empty theatrical experience. It needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be properly done. And it goes on for quite some time, from the 27th of June until the 4th of August. And then that committee has until the 11th of September to report back to the National Assembly on its findings. There'll also be a colloquium which will be held here at Parliament, as well as more public hearings at Parliament from public interest groups, not just people living out, ordinary South Africans, but NGO groups, church groups, and research groups.
Annika, given how emotive the conversation on land has there been any, measures been put in place in terms of where these hearings will be held in the various provinces? I imagine that the MPs are not going into it expecting that it's going to all be hunky-dory, for lack of a better phrase.
I should think that, it is such an emotive issue. It's already one that's been started in a way, because there have actually been roadshows on land claims in the past few weeks. It started, I think, 2 weeks ago in the Northern Cape in Priska, about people who made land claims years ago and still have not had those any of those forms or any of those wishes fulfilled by the state. And it really is also ahead of 2019, so it becomes politicized, which is also one of the issues surrounding and the push for it to take place now, I suppose, before 2019. Should there be a successful outcome to the amendment of the legislation, it'll be a big coup for the ANC going into 2019. But it is an issue that has been brewing and bubbling for many years. If you look at some of the stats, South Africa has the highest rate of black people who have been dispossessed of their land from colonial times. And when the ANC came into power in 1994, they promised to redistribute 30% of South Africa's 60,000 commercial farms. Only 8% is now in black hands. So it will be an emotive issue. It's 24 MPs who are gearing up to crisscross on this roadshow across the country, report back, and really make sure that they do it in a meaningful way that hears the voices of all South Africans.
All right.